Well, it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce our splendid guests from, well, actually from various parts of Europe. And this session will be a little bit different from the previous sessions. You could notice that the papers of the presenters, they don't have titles. This is not a mistake. This is the goal of the session, because actually the goal of the session was to provide a wider context to all those issues we were discussing earlier, during the previous sessions. Because, well, the main topic, of course, is secularization. But we were talking a lot about the word of social bubbles during one of the sessions. The bubbles we live in, the bubbles we are caught in. And the goal of the session actually is to break the bubbles. Our guests have the experience of life and academic career also in different cultural European contexts. So actually our purpose is to ask our guests about, well, their experience of secularization, of all those issues from their specific perspective. So let me introduce our guest. First presenter is Professor András Matetot. I hope I didn't mispronounce. From Hungary, from University of Szeged. Professor is, well, he's professor for the study of theology, but he also teaches theological courses at Vienna University in Austria. And his research interests are, well, changes in the religiosity in Central and Eastern Europe, also new religious movements in Europe, sociology, and well, related issues. Well, our next presenter is Professor Zuzana Kostičová, a religious studies scholar from the Czech Republic, from the Religious Studies Department of the Hussite Theological Faculty at Charles University in Prague. And her research interests are in well, history and religion of the Mesoamerican cultures, especially Maya civilization, but also new religious movements and new religiosity. Well, our third presenter, well, Professor Ursula Penkala. This will be the German context. Professor has a habilitation in the church history. For many years, she conducted her research in the Leibniz Institute for European History in Mainz. And her research is focused especially on the Polish-German and French-German relations after the Second World War, the reconciliation between the nations. And our last presenter who will be present is Professor Marek Blaza from the Catholic Academy in Warsaw. But his research interests are in ecumenism, sacramentology, and his focus is on Eastern churches, especially Byzantine tradition. He can himself celebrate liturgy in three rites. So until now, we were focusing on the Roman context, Roman Catholic context. This will be, the perspective from the Eastern Orthodox perspective, and a few technical issues. Each presenter has 15 minutes for their presentation, but feel free to make it either shorter or longer. Feel free. This session is different, so 15, 20, 25, it's up to you. Afterwards, after all those presentations, there will be a discussion. So I definitely will have questions to each of the presenters, but also you can interact among yourself, and we hope that there will be questions from the audience. The audience may write messages on the chat, but also you can do it in Polish. I will translate, so you can write privately to me, and I will try to well, pose the questions. So first, Professor Matetot András, will you have a PowerPoint presentation or without? No. Okay. So we ask the host to give the image. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can say only one sentence in Polish. Niech będzie pochwalony Jezus Chrystus. I hope it is in a theological conference practically the core issue of every lectures. Thank you for the introduction. Frankly speaking, I am a little bit shocked with this idea 15 minutes because I prepared a regular lecture 25 minutes. So I hope the other contributors will have a big heart and allow me to finish my presentation. I have a title. My title is Central and Eastern Europe as a Locus Theologicus. And I want to underline, I don't want to speak about secularization, but I try to offer an approach to Central and Eastern Europe, which is, according my research, is a better possibility to understand our contemporary, as well our contemporary situations and thinking traditions as the sociological theorem called secularization. So I start with my own way, and I hope strongly for a very vivid discussion. So I start with the region, Central and Eastern Europe, understand as a locus. In recent years, several novels have been published in Central and Eastern Europe dealing with the problem of what it means to have a homeland, what it means to be at home somewhere. Home is a burning issue for the theologian too, if for no other reason because he writes and teaches in a particular language. His mother tongue is his spiritual home and the medium in which his ideas are born and communicated. For the authors of novels, the question of home is anything but a simple question. Some examples. Home is the place where the blood of our heroes flowed. Home is the language we speak. Home is the cemetery where our ancestors rest. Our grandmother's kitchen with the smell of our favorite food. Our memories. And the landscape where we make our pilgrimage. All this is home for the theologian too, but the theologian is also at home in other things, like the sources of revelation, in the normative teaching of the magisterium, the works of the great theologians, and in the ecclesial context in which he or she works. In contemporary theology, the terms home and place are not used to denote the geographical, cultural, and spiritual context that determines understanding and articulation. Contemporary Catholic theology speaks of a context marked by the scenes of the times. It speaks of processes that define the present age in a paradigmatic way and amid which the content of revelation shines forth in a new light. Although the Second Vatican Council referred to global processes, it was followed by a momentum of reflection on regional processes. Thus, theology of liberalization reflecting on Latin American conditions. Black theology generated by African conditions. Feminist theology sensitive to the social situation of women, or a new political theology sensitive to anti-Semitism. Along these lines, in the last 20 years, we have seen considerable efforts in post-Gulag theological initiatives, inspired by the social and cultural challenges of Central and Eastern Europe. In my presentation, I will first show that in my interpretation, the primary characteristic of Central and Eastern Europe is a wounded collective identity. Second, I will argue that the presence of historical trauma is the locus theologicus that makes contemporary ecclesial and theological processes in the region intelligible and analyzable. I also argue that an acknowledgement of the woundedness of collective identity can generate an autopoietic theology. I will conclude my presentation with some provocative reflections, understood it in the primary sense of the word. Provocare means to elicit opinions. So I mentioned the technical term wounded collective identity. But what means woundedness? If I want to understand Central and Eastern European societies in terms of the long and short-term historical experience and memory culture of the region, the traumas suffered are the main motive. The geopolitical and geocultural location of the region is primarily characterized by its betweenness, between West and East, if we think of Central Europe. Let me remember to define the region, or Central and Eastern European region, geographically. The Polish politician Józef Piłsudski coined the term Międzymorze, Latin for intermarium, which views our region as being situated between the North Sea, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic. What is important for me in this definition of the region is not what it was, an idea of political independence in Central and Eastern Europe. It is as well very interesting, but it is the public element in the term that is significant. If we replace the sea, the word sea, with hegemony, we find the main characteristic of the region's centuries-old and contemporary zeitgeist, międzyhegemonia, if I try to make a Polish word for you, sorry for it. I wrote about this in detail some years ago in a published study as well, of which I will only recall the most important statements here. The region is a collision zone between the political, cultural, and religious superpowers of the East and the West. The main desire and the most powerful recruiting and motivating slogan of the region's cultural and political leaders over the last 200 years has been independence and autonomy. Trauma has played the leading role in the region's collective memory. The occupations, population exchanges, the forced labor camps, death camps, and in contrast, the struggles for freedom and independence and their heroes mark the primary axis of collective memory. To designate this trauma-centric memory, I use the term wounded collective identity. If we concentrate to the last and perhaps most important change and challenge in our region, it is the so-called system change, 1989 and 1991. The woundedness of and a deep collective desire for freedom and autonomy make the region's spiritual condition like the post-Babylonian Deuteronomic era by a biblical association. After the Babylonian captivity, the remembrance of the original law, the organization of the teaching of the law, the re-establishment of a system of ritual practices, and later the rebuilding of the temple were the main objectives of Judaism. These were the goals set out by the prophets of the time, Nehemiah and Ezra, and it was along these lines that the Jewish people were reunited, cleansed of the impure traditions of Babylonia. After the political system change of 1989 and 1991, societies in the region sought to recognize themselves on the basis of constitutional democracy and freedom, while radically distancing themselves from foreign influences, especially the Soviet legacy. Political and ecclesiastical leaders, in mutual support and legitimacy, set about rebuilding a free and autonomous Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary, and as well as the Baltic and the Balkan states. The post-regime change era is structurally comparable to the Deuteronomic era. However, there is a significant difference in spirit, which makes one think. In Deuteronomy and related biblical works, the focus on theological understanding is on the covenant with God, God's people, the poor, and the stranger. In contrast, the new societies of freedom, however, the creation of new capitalists or capitalism, new oligarchs, new bourgeoisie seems to take priority over the upfillment of the poor and the integration of the stranger. The foreigner is defined as a threatening enemy in identity political public culture. Not always, but often. Social and cultural processes along the post-Babylonian paradigm become analyzable and understandable on the basis of the so-called wounded collective identity approach. The centuries-long lack of freedom, independence, and autonomy, and its deep impact on the collective identity have something as a post-traumatic syndrome effect on the members and those responsible for society. In the Deuteronomic period, Ezra and Nehemiah opted for innovation from both a political and religious point of view. They retracted the Torah's formulations of Moses on Mount Sinai in the light of contemporary conditions. The most important question, therefore, for the theological processes and positions in the region is how and in what quality this kind of retractation takes place. Looking to the theological tendencies of the region in the past 30 years, I am very involved in the international level. I would like once again short to take a last look at the Deuteronomistic period. It's worth to recalling the figure and work of Ezra. Ezra was a scribe, a leader, and pioneer in the reconstruction of Jewish legal knowledge and spirituality after the Babylonian captivity. Ezra draws attention to the importance of theology in an area of radical societal and economic transformation. Just as the reinterpretation of the Torah was the guiding principle for the construction of society and culture after Babylon, we must ask how the interpretation of the basic concept of Christianity was and is present in the life of societies and churches that have regained their freedom after the collapse of the Soviet dictatorship. In other words, the question is, I repeat it once again, what kind of spirituality theology represents in these countries, and what kind of social and ecclesial function it can perform? When I ask this question, I want to clear up a few misunderstandings immediately. The first is naivety. The question is not whether theology plays the same role in post-Soviet countries as it does in Western European countries or the United States. I do not take these countries as a benchmark. My question is about the sense of responsibility, the theological identity with which the theologians see themselves in our region. The second misunderstanding, which I would certainly like to dispel, is the question of quality. I am not suggesting that all theologians in the region should soar to Ranerian or Balthasarian heights. On the contrary, I am interested in the extent to which theological education and research in our countries is able and willing to consider its social and cultural embeddedness as locus theologicus, as a sign of the times generating theology. I have found some answers to my questions, at least of a temporary nature, which I would like to put up for discussion. My answer, based on my experience and analysis, is that theology and theologians in our region are characterized, or can be or should be characterized, primarily by homelessness. Two kinds of homelessness, I mean, the structural and the intellectual. First, the structural homelessness. Theology is a science. There are structural conditions for the cultivation of science. Except for exceptional theologians, the cultivation of theology requires the same structural conditions as the cultivation of literature, history, or other human and social sciences. But if we compare the structural conditions under which scholars work in the large public universities in our region, we see that compared to them, the theology scholars are academic homeless, paria. Rarely are they allowed to do academic work independent of pastoral and other church assignments. In theology departments, they are only rarely assistants. There are rarely grants for theological research. Academic promotion in theology is rarely supported by creative freedom. While under communism, the conditions for cultivation of theology were extremely poor for ideological and political reasons. 30 years after the change of regime, the situation has changed at most in the theological faculties and training places. The only change is that they can carry out their work in renovated or newly constructed buildings, but I think in the same structural homelessness. There is an even more thought-provoking aspect of this structural homelessness, the position of theology inside the church. Several theologians report that theologians are not involved in the church leadership in pastoral planning and decision-making processes. Theologians are not considered as experts in the church. Rather, church positions are discussed with political experts and practicing politicians by official representatives. The church leadership does not seem to care about the theological knowledge that candidates for the priesthood acquire in preparation for the priesthood. Nor do they care about the theological preparation of the religious education people and the theologically viewed textbooks are used. Perhaps one reason for the structural homelessness of theology within the church is that those serving high up in the hierarchy receive the suppressive theological training of the communist era. Rarely do they have quality theological training and international experience. Some have, some has, but it is a minority. In their view, satisfactory pastoral ministry requires a clergy with a deep spirituality and unswerving loyalty, rather than intellectual and theological preparation. Another reason may be that the church leadership applies the divine command of repair in the St. Francis sense to church building and funding, and less to the development of the content of evangelization. The other type of homelessness is the intellectual homelessness. Closely related to the structural homelessness of theology is the intellectual homelessness of theology. It seems to me that theologians in the region tend to build on classical, well-known theological positions and authors rather than on creative and innovative theological proposals. It's rare to find them developing their positions in dialogue with contemporary philosophical and social contexts, using their conceptual framework. In teaching theological subjects, students are required to study a particular textbook. Theological knowledge means the knowledge of the textbook and not the formation of one's own position from the critical comparison of different views. I have elsewhere called this attitude reprint theology. After the system change, reprints of many previous books were published, and this was the case in theology too. But these once excellent works are rarely helpful in the dialogue with the zeitgeist today. And even if knowledge of them may be important from many points of view, the theology they convey is only mutatis mutandis suitable for providing a theological basis for dialogue with contemporary cultural processes. After the system change, another phenomenon in the theological processes of the region was the publication of translations of German, French, and Italian works after the Concile. It is called by me as import theology. Those that the communist censors did not allow to be published because they were considered to reflect the decadent capitalist spirit of the West, began to be translated and published, taking advantage of the freedom. These works were written in the intellectual boom that followed the Second Vatican Concile. As the theologians of the region were cut off from these effervescence by an iron curtain, an adequate understanding of these works lacks these experiences. These excellent Western European and American works were written with the problems of the North Atlantic cultural hemisphere in mind. They have contributed much to the development of theological thought through their methodologies and theological creativity, but they are not well suited to provide theological insights that are appropriate to the contemporary intellectual conditions of our Central and Eastern European region. In the case of contemporary Western or synodal theological works, the regional nihil obstat edition even includes the filtering criterion of how church critical the work is. How church critical the work is. The chance of publishing works that are more critical for either the universal church or the local church in the region are low. Even today, censors maintain the perception developed under communism that tensions within the church must be kept secret, because if they come to light, they will be a useful tool for the persecuting power. This caution against communism is applied after the regime change, not only to the successor parties of communism, but also to the so-called liberal parties. The explanation for the preference for a theology that has been reprinted from the past, a theology imported from the West, and a theology that has a chinovnik-like loyalty to the church, all these are rooted in a conception of society and the church that sees itself as threatened, wounded collective identity, I remember. These dominant attitudes are well understood, almost taken for granted from the perspective of a wounded collective identity. the experience of constant threat and vulnerability is inherited and becomes a mindset. Whatever promotes the independence, unity, and stability of the community is an absolute priority. In this context, it is understandable that the theological and ecclesiastical manifestations of our region, in sync with the preferences of the population, see the new, the unusual, the alien as a threat. For this reason, too, the response in theology is one of certainty rather than uncertainty, of the traditional rather than the new, and of the reinforcing rather than the critical. If the sources and mechanisms of action of the wounded collective identity are not understood and processes, the theology of the region will not be able to find its way to an autopoietic tools and language. May I have 5 minutes more or no more?
Yes, 5 minutes is okay.
5 minutes is okay, thank you very much. As I promised, I would like to offer some provocative ideas on the end. I would like to speak something about theological aphasia. Aphasia is an inability to comprehend or formulate language because of damage to specific brain regions. To paraphrase the phenomenon of aphasia in the diagnosis of regional theology, it is perhaps not an ex-aggregation to say that, as a result of certain historical, social, and ecclesiastical insults, theology cannot find its own words, its own language in which to formulate its revelation-based positions in accordance with the requirements of the times. The symptom of aphasia does not affect intelligence, according to the medical literature. When language returns after healing, existing thoughts became communicable again. In social terms, Czesław Miłosz captured this condition with impressive imagery. I quote him, "The masses in the people's democracies behave like a man who wants to cry out in his sleep and cannot find his voice." End quote. Miłosz, however, does not see the cause of this terrible experience in what is so often referred to in public discourse about the ecclesiastical and theological situation, namely external circumstances. Miłosz does not attribute the aphasia of the population to structural causes, but to internal causes. In his view, the problem is not one of the abilities to speak, but of the ability to think. I quote him once again, "They not only dare not speak, but they do also not know what to say." End quote. The main difficulty of the theology and ecclesia thinking in the Central and Eastern European region is not the ever-changing language in which it can articulate the ever-changing truths that are always being revealed. The main difficulty, it is my provocation, lies in thinking of revealed truth as something objectively constant and not as something always revealing. Indeed, in the publications of theologians in our countries, the need for dialogue with the modern or post-modern zeitgeist is often raised. Not infrequently, there is a call to adopt the theological approach of the Second Vatican Council. But Heilsgeschichte kind vision of eternal divine truth, continually revealed in history, it is, I think, rarely present. I think I close now, and thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I will definitely have questions, but I will ask them later. Thank you for your presentation, and I will ask Professor Zuzana Kostičová from Prague. Try to move her to stage. Oh, it works. Great. This will be the Czech context. So if you can present your paper, and later on we will participate in the discussion.
Unlike the previous speaker, I will speak about secularization, and I will not speak about theology. I am not a theologian, I'm a religious studies scholar, and although I have been presented as an expert in the pre-Columbian religions of America, that is an old story which is not true anymore. What I am focusing on now is the contemporary alternative spirituality, the so-called New Age. And what I'm going to say here is deeply influenced by this fact that I'm focused on the alternative spirituality, and I will start by giving a short presentation about the secularization in the Czech Republic and about the numbers. I will greatly rely here on sociology. Most importantly, about I used as the most contemporary source. I used Professors Václavík Nešpor and Hamplová's article from 2018, which is called Religious Situation in Contemporary Czech Society, which is probably the newest, kind of summary about how Czech Republic is related to religions and how many people do believe in what. So basically, Czech Republic tends to be quoted among the most atheist countries in Europe, and we tend to call ourselves the most atheistic country in Europe. But I have discovered in many conferences and many other contexts that there are also, contestants to this title of the most atheist country in the world, such as Estonia or East Germany, etc. I will not try to find some kind of result of which one is the most atheist. What is important that these countries have the least percentage of those who call themselves or who claim to belong to traditional religions. According to Václavík Nešpor and Hamplová in the article that I quoted, they say that, and I quote, Czech Republic or Czech religiosity is characterized by high levels of privatization and individualization, as well as strong distrust in traditional religious institutions, which means most importantly traditional Christian churches. And that's another quote, despite low levels of membership in religious institutions and low participation in religious activities, Czechs are not indifferent towards religious and spiritual phenomena. A rather high level of, and they quote, religious illiteracy is another important feature of the Czech religious landscape, end quote. What that means is that the Czechs are in general very low, there is very low religiosity in the Czech Republic, and if there is, it is not very institutionalized. It's not characterized by belonging. In the words of Grace Davy, of course, all of you know Grace Davy and her concept of believing without belonging. This is something that applies to Czech spirituality, Czech religiosity in a very strong manner. That is, there are some Czechs who do believe in traditional religions, mostly Christianity, but about half of them are non-practicing. Now, when it comes to numbers, let me quote some numbers. We are doing population census every 10 years, starting with 1991. So we have available data from 1991, 2001 and 2011. We already have some data from 2021, but since the survey is very recent, the census has been I don't know, a few months back done. So there are no results published yet. So we have no idea about the most recent development of the numbers of related to religiosity. So after the fall of communism, the 3 years later, in 1991, the census showed that 44% of the population stated in the census that they adhere to some kind of traditional religion. And from this number, most of them, the vast majority, were Catholic Christians. In the census from 2001, it dropped about 10 to 15%. So it was like 32% stating that they belong to some kind of traditional religion. This type of decrease in the numbers is probably due to the mortality of the oldest generation, which is traditionally the most religious in the Czech Republic. And then in 2011, it dropped even lower to about 14%, and in the census, about 7 additional percent stated that they do feel they are believers, Christians or something, that they do feel themselves being part of some kind of traditional religions. However, they are non-practicing. So we have like more or less 10 to 15% practicing members of traditional religions, and additional 7 to 10% more or less of non-practicing, which makes a total of a maximum 20%, which is very, very low. And as I said, the data from 2021 are not available yet, but I would say this is, of course, trying to predict something from a crystal ball, but I would say the number has fallen even lower. We will see what happens. So that means again, we have about half and half, believing and practicing and believing and non-practicing, but they form like 1/5 of the population maximum. Now, who are the rest of these people? Because this is an important question. Who are the rest of these people? Because we have like 80% of population, and we have no idea what these people think. So some of them, of course, are traditional atheists, which is, I'd say, some of those atheists are the traditional old atheists formed by the communist regime. Secularization in Czech Republic is not due strictly to the problem of the communist regime. It sometimes appears in the popular discourse, but I'd say it's a very common misconception. In fact, there has been a lot of, I'd say, there has been a speeding of secularization in the first half of the 20th century already. After World War I, that's one moment after the fall of Austro-Hungarian Empire and the state Catholicism that went with it. There was a very rapid secularization in what is called the First Czechoslovak Republic, which was, after or during and after the World War II, it has sped again. This didn't affect that much the Christians, but the Jews, for example, because those would count into members of traditional religions. But of course, we know what happened to the Jews during the World War II. And after the World War II, of course, came the communist regime, which was the third moment in which the secularization deepened. So after, as I said, again, as the censuses show, there was this upsurge of religiosity after the end of the communist regime, but then a steep fall, which ended up with 20%. Now, again, the rest of the people, the atheists, therefore, are not confined strictly to those who have been raised under communist regime. We also have the new atheism, which, of course, all of you, this is the new atheism connected to scientific skepticism, which is an international movement of today connected with scientism and with a belief in science. We have, of course, in the public sphere, we have new atheism in a very, I'd say, not prominent, but very visible form with a Sisyphus society, which is a skeptical society which tends to, publicly criticize both religion and alternative spirituality. Then we have those 80%, again, some of them are hardcore atheists, but I'd say a big part of them are what Tomáš Halík calls the apatheists, which are people more or less indifferent. We have a beautiful word in Czech, a popular word, niecismus, coming from něco, which means something. The somethingists, I believe in something. But what I wanted to end up with is the problem of alternative spirituality. And I'd say that in the traditional sociology, up till more or less now, the situation has changed greatly, but formerly, alternative spirituality was not focus of sociology, and we all know Thomas Lackman's criticism of this situation in his book, The Invisible Religion, because this is connected to the way how sociology asks about religion. And when religion is private, it's much harder to ask, and even more so when religion is not, I'd say, self-defined, where there is very low usage of some kind of auto-denominator, the way how those people call themselves. It makes really hard for the sociologists to ask, are you member of alternative spirituality? Because the term is not intelligible. So what is alternative spirituality? It formerly used to be called the New Age. However, increasingly the experts in the last, I'd say, 20 years have refrained from using the term New Age because, in fact, and again, as I said, it's not used as auto-denominator today. So what happens is that the term New Age tends to be reserved for the 1960s and 1970s for the countercultural generational movement, which is connected to the hippies movement. And afterwards, in 1980s, some theorists said that the New Age movement has disappeared, but it has not disappeared. What happened is that the New Age movement former came out into the mainstream, and it integrated itself in the mainstream in such a way that it became what Thomas Lackman calls the invisible religion. That is, again, what sociology says, the functioning institutions are invisible. This thing is largely invisible, both for the sympathizers and adherents, and for the rest of the society. There tend to exist some derogatory terms that tend to capture this type of thing. In Czech Republic, there's the term ESO, which is something that tends to, highlight the connection to esotericism. However, alternative spirituality is not esoteric, it's actually exoteric. It's there for everyone. It's not a secret society. Everyone can access the texts, everyone can discuss things on the internet. And coming to internet, it's of course highly active on the new media, on the digital media. And as the traditional religions tend to have problems with the digital media for several reasons, which I'm not going to go into, and they tend to, try to integrate the media and to, adapt them for their needs and to avoid some potentially problematic effects the digital media have, mostly on religious authority. Alternative spirituality has no such problem. It is, in this sense, in great advantage, and it basically spreads freely in the digital environment. What does this have to do with the religiosity in Czech Republic? Well, as I said, it's quite problematic to ask how many people are believers, quote unquote, in alternative spirituality in Czech Republic, because there is no common auto denominator. If you ask, generally those people say, I am, and you know this, of course, everyone does, I am spiritual, not religious. But asking people, are you spiritual, would mess things up, because Christians, of course, would answer yes as well. Other adherents to traditional religions. So it's kind of hard to ask. And the contemporary surveys in the last decade tended to ask, do you believe in astrology? Do you believe in cards? Do you frequent such these and these types of events, etc., etc.? And surprisingly, you know, these data are not commensurable, because they were gained in different manners and different ways. But however, it gives us some kind of orientation in the problem. We have probably around 40%, 40, not 14, 40% at least. And these are data from the past decade. That is, it may have grown even higher. So we have 40% of people that in this or that way do adhere to contemporary alternative spirituality. So this raises a question, does the concept of secularization still work? Because if we are speaking about secularization and we are speaking about religiosity, the Czech Republic, again, as I said in the beginning of my paper, is one of the lowest. The countries with the lowest religiosity in Europe. But if you count those that tend to, adhere to alternative spirituality, if we can, add these numbers, which is highly problematic, but again, if we can, it's 60% of population that is either adhering to traditional religions, whether they are practicing or not, and they are adhering to alternative spirituality, whether they are practicing or not. Which means, are we really so secularized as we think? I think not. And as I had the opportunity to speak about colleagues from Estonia, I do have the same impression that Estonia probably is more or less the same situation, right? So perhaps this is another way how we can look at secularization. And this is, I'm so sorry to say this on a theological conference, but perhaps secularization is not a crisis of religion as such. Perhaps secularization is a crisis of Christianity and traditional religions at large in Europe. And where we have the least Christianity, the more we have alternative spirituality. In this sense, alternative spirituality is not a movement. It's not a new religious movement. It's a new global religion. So I'd say this is a nice place to end up my paper. Something to think about. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. Questions ready. So thank you for your paper. I will definitely ask them after the last paper. But now I will ask Professor Ursula Penka. I will try to move her to the stage. Yes, it is working. Great. German context this time. So we are ready, I think.
Yeah. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear everything. It works.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this panel. The title of my paper is actually the title of this entire panel. And I will start with a brief overview of the situation in Germany. In Germany, we can observe two phenomena simultaneously. On the one hand, it's a decreasing numbers of church members of the main traditional confessions, the Catholics and the Protestants. On the other hand, we have increasing religious plurality in the course of migrations. Traditionally, the Christian denominations in the form of the Catholic and the Protestant churches were the dominant factor in religious life of Germany. They influenced strongly both the society and politics. Until the First World War, almost 99% of the population was Protestant or Catholic. An erosion can be observed since the 1970s, speeding up with the reunification in Germany, of Germany. So today we have about 50% of members of the society are members of the major Christian denominations. About 7% are Muslims, and all others religious make 1%. Even though the Christian churches still formally represent the largest group of believers, the loss of significance is obvious. After this brief statistics, I would like to offer a rather systematic view on the ongoing processes from my perspective as both fundamental theologian and church historian. First of all, I would like to emphasize that secularization is not a one-way street, but it's a very complex process. In order to demonstrate this internal dynamics of this process, I referred to the research perspective elaborated at the Leibniz Institute of European History in Mainz in Germany, where I used to work for several years. We used there a pair of terms, which are sacralization and desacralization, in order to describe manifestations and changes of fundamental values within the society. And doing so, we abandoned the term of secularization as a kind of long-term teleological process of abandoning religion or religious values. And we emphasized with the terms of secularization and desacralization rather a mutable nature of the sacred. With the term secularization, we can describe the processes and practices through which people and actions, but also objects, spaces, are established and perceived as absolute, intangible, normative, or stabilizing order. These include, of course, also religion, but also political ideas, nation, progress, technology, individual or human rights, art, and nature. At the same time, desacralization refers to those processes through which sacralized institutions and phenomena change or even lose their status. Now, I would like to apply this model of sacralization and desacralization to some examples of today's Germany coming from very different contexts. So I'm starting with the desacralization. The first example, I would mention here the traditional Catholic spiritual practices or symbols, which are changed into a kind of secular ones and thus desacralized in some way. One of examples would be the fascination with Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen, Benedictine nun living in the 12th century, one of the most influential women of the Middle Ages, mystic, composer, and writer. But today, Hildegard is associated in Germany rather with her natural medicine methods and healthy cuisine than with her spiritual heritage. The church institutions themselves contribute to this situation, offering workshops and courses on fasting and good nutrition according to Hildegard. The main purpose of these events, opened not only for engaged Christians, is the harmony of body and mind, and in other words, the well-being. The religious aspect of fasting is present only in the background. The second example of kind of desacralization is very different from the first one. I would like to refer here to the German-French and German-Polish reconciliation processes after the World War II. Both processes engaged Christians who deliberately applied the theological concept of reconciliation to the political context of the post-war relations between the nations or states. However, the religiously connotated concept of reconciliation was desacralized in the course of its transfer from the religious to the political sphere. The reference to God disappeared from the political understanding of reconciliation, but such elements as discovering the truth about the past, asking and granting forgiveness, gestures of atonement and compensation are still maintained in this political understanding of reconciliation. And nowadays, reconciliation is regarded as one of the political long-term strategies to overcome conflicts. Example number 3, again, very different context, academic theology. It seems that the primary frame of reference for the German academic theology is the university and the academic community and not the church, even though professors are required to have missio canonica, with one exception of the Goethe University of Frankfurt. Theological faculties are fully integrated into the academic system, which is very competitive and where economic factors play an important role. That means that theological research has also to be competitive in many respects on the German and international academic market, so to speak. Because if theological institutes do not attract students, do not bring grants and prestige to the universities, they can be reduced or even closed. In this situation, it is not enough for theological faculties that they provide training for priests and teachers, but it's also necessary that they provide research results which can be justified on the methodological level and convincingly communicated, also in the interdisciplinary context. Under such circumstances, the German academic theology loses in a way its sacred status, but it gains, I think, more freedom of thought and more connectivity to other academic disciplines and to the modern world. What about the opposite direction? Now, 2 examples of sacralization. In Germany, we can observe also that ideas and principles which are not originally religious get a kind of sacred status. The first example is a fight or opposing against every kind of intolerance and discrimination, which got in the way sacralized in the mainstream public. It concerns especially the anti-Semitism. There is a great sensitivity on this issue, in showing anti-Semitic attitudes may one cost at least a reputation, but often also the job. Sadly, there are still opposite attitudes within the society, but in the public, however, they are rejected by the majority. The second example of sacralizing of objects or phenomena which are not originally religious is the German constitution and democratic order. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, people were looking for a kind of common identification. Identifying with the nation seemed to be too close to the National Socialism. Since 1949, there were 2 German states, so it was also difficult to talk about one German national community. And in the same year, West Germany got a new constitution. And the first article opens with the sentence, "Human dignity is invulnerable. Menschenwürde ist unantastbar." The constitution and the values defined there became a basis for the common identification of the people in West Germany. If it was difficult to identify with the nation, people should identify with the constitution and the democratic values. That was the idea. This particular role of constitution has weakened today, but it can still be regarded as a kind of sacred normative order of modern Germany and a protection against nationalist and racist tendencies present within the German society today. So that would be examples of sacred outside of institutional religion. And now I'm coming to my closing remarks and also my thesis for the further discussion. The common way of thinking in church discourse about secularization is that it is a kind of threat to the church as allegedly betrayal of faith, values, and moral principles. But I'm not very convinced if this is really true. The church has no monopoly for moral acting. Charity and the defense of the rights of underprivileged is no longer the domain of the church. Sometimes even the opposite happens, as in the case of sexual abuse by clergy, where the impulse to account for crimes within the church comes often from outside, from this secular society, which at this point show more moral sense and empathy than members of the church hierarchy. What does this dynamics of secularization or the dynamics of sacralization and desacralization actually mean for theology? I would answer that question with two theses, what we should more consider in our theological work, as we ask for inspiration for the theology. First, I think we should stronger consider the work of Holy Spirit outside the church and the idea of human being as the image of God, which applies to all people, also non-believers. And second, on the level of the pastoral, we should more emphasize the need for the internal conversion of the church, Ecclesia semper reformanda, since it is evident that many of the misfortunes of the modern church do not lie in the process of secularization, but within the church itself. Even the failures, even we could say the failures within the church, often facilitate the secularization. And I would like to close with a brief question to the organizers of the conference, because I've noticed a remarkable contrast between the title of this panel, Secularization as Inspiration for Theology, and the title of the first panel of this morning, Ecclesial Tools to Fight Secularization. So my question would be, how do you want to bridge this gap? Do we want to fight, or do we want to get inspired? Or has this contrast been created intentionally? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the question also. I think that I will try to force Professor Wąsek, the main organizer of this conference, to answer the questions later. So thank you for your paper. Now Professor Marek Blaza, the Eastern context, Eastern churches.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful for the invitation. First of all, I would like to say that I will talk from my practice more, even I am a theologian, or I'm supposed to be a theologian.
Excuse me, we have some problems.
This is the official name of the church, Greek Catholic Church in Romania. Of course, it means that I have relationships also with the Orthodox, because we have in our parishes also the Orthodox, especially Ukrainians, sometimes Russians, Belarusians. So I will put just some questions, some issues. First of all is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, where after the collapse of communists, there were communists, we may say that there was a sort of process of secularism, But anyway, it came to light that in Ukraine, the faith survived. It was, of course, a sort of a revival of the faith after the communism. But also we can see one disturbing thing, one disturbing reality, that the religion was persecuted during the communist time, but not the superstition. The superstition was tolerated, and it means that even the faith, when the faith was already was already free from the communism, the faith was mixed with the superstition, and you can see it right now also among the believers in the Eastern churches. So after the communism, the underground church became an official church, and the first problem was the formation of clergy. There were in the beginning three types of clergy: the former Orthodox, who decided to become Greek Catholics, or they were really in a clandestine way Greek Catholics. Then the priests that were very quickly ordained without any solid formation, and finally those who passed the seminaries. And we have still these three types of clergy. Of course, maybe the first one and the second one is already in the minority, but if you speak to the clergy when they are together, you have to remember about the differences. The next thing, it is also mixed, it is linked, it is bound with the superstition, is the clericalization. But this clericalization is a bit different than in the Western Europe. I may say that this is something that in Poland we had in the 80s and 90s in the 20th century. So the priest is someone as demigod, as Superman. Yeah, there's someone who has the power of God, and this is why I come to the church, because they are the priests who can do miracles. And the superstition, for example, as for the priests, if a priest commits a crime, for instance, a priest stole something from a believer, from a lay man or lay woman, the Ukrainians, for instance, they would not go to the court because they would be afraid that misfortune will happen. Yeah, because this is the priest may curse me, and this is very dangerous to have a business with a priest in a bad way. Then if you ask the people, why do you observe fasting, or why do you receive Holy Communion on an empty stomach, they would say mostly because the priest told me to do so. They wouldn't say, I do it because I esteem the Blessed Sacrament. I know what is the Blessed Sacrament and how it is worthy that I receive the Blessed Sacrament on an empty stomach. No, it's not the question. The question is, the priest told me to do so. So you can observe also people who would go to a priest who has authority, an exorcist usually, and they will go for the masses, for the holy liturgies to him, because his holy liturgies are more powerful than of the other priests. And when he blessed the water is more blessed than the water blessed by another priest. So you can see there is really a big problem and challenge for us, the superstition. Another thing is the formation of the lay people. You have to remember that the people, they have knowledge, religion knowledge only from the babushka, yeah, from their grandparents. So the grandparents, their formation was from the handbooks from the 30s in the 20th century. So there is no mention there about the Second Vatican Council at all. And what we do in Warsaw, that we have a special lectures or catechism for the adults, because they need rudiments. Really, they need rudiments. They ask and they want to know it, but they are conscious. They are aware of that the lack of the knowledge is huge. Another thing that is against secularism, the process of secularism in Ukraine, is the war in the eastern Ukraine. And as we know, when there is a war, then God is needed, faith is needed. The soldiers who come to the churches, they are the priests who serve to the soldiers in the eastern Ukraine. Not only the Orthodox and the Greek Catholics, but also Roman Catholics, Protestant pastors, also they serve there. And the soldiers, they usually are looking for revenge. And this is also a big challenge to us, to convince them not to do it, not to come back to the eastern Ukraine to look for the revenge, especially when they were wounded during the war. As for the Ukrainians in Poland, we can say that the church, the communities, because majority of the communities, the parishes are in the Roman Catholic buildings, churches. So for the Ukrainians, the church is a sort of sanctuary, refuge. And the priest is not just a priest, he's an advocate, he is a physician, whatsoever. Because for them, it is not just a church, it's something like also, for example, the Polish people who work in the United Kingdom or in Western Europe, in Germany also, that they go to the church because, not just because of faith, but because of their identity. I'm Ukrainian, so I go to the Eastern liturgy, to my liturgy, Ukrainian liturgy. And something against secularism, I have to say, in Poland, you can observe it, you can see it, that there are women, Ukrainian women, who take care of the older people, Polish people. The older people, I mean, 80, they are 80, 90, sometimes years old, and they regard themselves as atheists or agnostics. And you can imagine that the Ukrainians, they are talking about God to the Polish old women, usually, sometimes men. And finally, the Polish older people come back to their faith. They find their faith before their death. Yeah, so it means that really the Ukrainian women who take care of the older people, the Polish people, they make a sort of an apostolate in Poland. You can also see in the churches young men working at the building construction, And they are every Sunday and every feast in the church. Of course, there's not a very huge number, but they are. And they come every Sunday with a van to participate at the liturgy. But on the other hand, the majority of the Ukrainians, they don't go to church. Sometimes they go to the, as they say, the Polish church. It means the Roman Catholic Church, because the Ukrainians use the notion, the term, the Polish church, yeah, because we have a Ukrainian church and then there's the Polish church. And unfortunately, it is very difficult to target these Ukrainians. Of course, sometimes we go not even to the marketplaces where they sell something, and we try to invite them to the church, but usually they ignore us. Even if we are in the Cossacks, they ignore us. So the majority, they don't go to the church, because you can see, if so, there would be much more parishes in Poland than it is. And now another thing, very interesting maybe for us, the faith in Ukraine and the faith in the Russian Federation. Because you see, as I said, really in Ukraine, the faith survived. The faith was verified by the communists, but the faith existed even during the communist time in the underground church. And if you want to understand, maybe some of you, you know that the majority of the believers of the Orthodox Church of the Patriarchate of Moscow is in Ukraine. Yes, and this is why the Moscow Patriarchate doesn't want to give the autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because it would mean that the first, as for the number of the believers, first Orthodox autocephalous Orthodox Church would be Ukrainian, the Ukrainian one, not the Russian one. What is more, the Russian would be just the third one, only the third one, because the second one would be then the Romanian Orthodox Church. So you can see that would be very interesting to my Czech colleagues here. We can discuss it, that because as far as I know, that there was something similar, that in the Czech Republic, the atheism or secularization is not just bonded with the communist time, and the same we would say about Russia. It is not that during the communist time the faith disappeared on the territory of the Russian Federation. It seems that there was no solid faith also before the communist period on the territory of Russian Empire. So, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church would say that everyone who lives on the Russian territory is an Orthodox in potency. Yeah, something like anonymous Christians, as Karl Rahner was talking about that. And you can see also the ties, strong ties between the state and the church in the Russian Federation. Like 1 year ago, there was an event, very special event, dedication of the Church of the Armed Forces in Moscow. The Patriarch Kirill made the dedication, blessed, consecrated the church, and with him there was present the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Mr. Sergei Shoigu. Yes. So You can see also another, as for the links between the politicians and the church, or state in the church. It is very interesting that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, in this context, is, even in Ukraine, this is a minority church, because the majority, they are Orthodox. It means really that the politicians are not so very much interested in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, especially those Ukrainians, those politicians from Kiev, maybe the local authorities from the Western Ukraine, because only in the Western Ukraine, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is the majority of the Christians. So it means really, as we talk also with the hierarchy about that this is something positive, that the politicians are not interested in us as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but they are also, of course, interested in the Orthodox Church. And then the question, the issue of autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, it is not just a religious matter, it is also a politician matter, because the President Poroshenko, he strongly recommended and strongly pushed the process to make the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And of course, the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, he did so. But you can see the very strong bonds between the state and the church among the Eastern churches. And another bond, it is the church and the nation. I'd say that every really Eastern church is a sort of ethnical church. Yes, you can see even I mentioned the Romanian church, or the Greek Catholic Church in Romania is called officially the Romanian Church United with Rome. The Orthodox, the Romanian Orthodox Church. Yeah, the Greek Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So you have to put the adjective that concerns the nation. This is so important. You can see, for example, that in Poland, I was one of those who translated the liturgy, the text of the Byzantine liturgy, into Polish language as official language, and we have the official liturgical books already. 1 year ago, 2 years ago, no, 1 year ago it was accepted. Yes, you can see 1 year ago we have in Polish, finally, in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the liturgical books, but we don't use them because there was one priest who started to celebrate in Polish, and the Ukrainians in Poland, they wrote a letter of protest against this practice, that the Polonization started in Poland. So we see the process just the opposite. There are some Poles who are fed up of the Roman Catholic Church because of politics, because of nationalism, and they go to us and they see the same also nationalism, and they have to be Ukrainized. Yeah, Ukrainization process begins. So they start to learn Ukrainian, although they have no roots whatsoever. But this is very specific for the Polish context. Of course, that in Germany or in Great Britain or in France, they may use the vernacular languages there as you want to, but the context of Polish, yeah, the Polish, it is prohibited. It is forbidden to use the Polish language. because of the historical context between two nations. It is not recommended. So you can see then that officially the state will support the Eastern churches because the state needs the moral vertebrate, I'd say, the moral vertebrate. There are also atheists who send their children to the Orthodox or Greek Catholic schools because they will get the moral vertebrate. Yeah, and this, it means, another thing is, of course, that in the state schools, there are no religion. Yes, they might be ethics, but not religion. But in the confessional schools, like the Orthodox Greek Catholics, it is possible. And the last thing that I would like to mention is the morality. The morality, especially, you can see the question of homosexuality. In the Eastern churches, it is out of the question, really. It is condemned. It is condemned. And when I have lectures with the seminarians and the lay people, lay students, I see that the lay students to this homosexuality, the question of homosexuality, are more tolerant than the seminarians. The seminarians, they condemn and they say that they should be beaten, that they should be go for the treatment, the homosexuals. So it is, I know that from the point of view to the Westernians, it is something that it is very difficult to understand. And also they get married very early. They are 20, they 21, 22, and they get married. So very early. So finally, my last sentence is, it is very difficult to talk about secularization in the Eastern churches, because the Eastern churches themselves, this is something like two parallel lines which cross 3 times. Yes, 2 parallel lines which cross 3 times. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your paper. Well, once again, the session is too short. Well, so we will try to move our panelists to the scene, to the stage. Yes. One more. Is it working? Yes. Yes, great. It's all working. So, unfortunately, we don't have much time, but I have my questions ready, and Professor Wąsek said that he will answer the question of Professor Ursula Pęka at the end of the session. He will. But we will begin. I mean, I have the first question to Professor Mate Andreas. This is because, well, he will have to leave punctually because he will have another meeting. So if the meeting will be longer, just feel free to leave. I'm sorry. But my question concerns the idea of that collective identity. Well, I was thinking about our answer as theologian. So this is interesting for me that we don't think about our theological practice as about therapy as a kind of therapy. But my question is whether you can see some way how theology could be inspiring for other discourses, academic discourses, social sciences, for the secular context. Our Christian theology, because we generally look from the other perspective.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we should make another conference about your question. And I am sure all participants in this panel would have be able to bring original ideas to this second conference. So I wrote an entire book in German 2 years ago by Springer publishing house about your question, but very short to be close to the core topic of our panel, question of secularization. I think the theory of secularization and the point of view or the approach of secularization brings for us an approach, something as a hotspot. And then we see in the light of the theory of secularization, the reality, the colorful reality of our countries or of our region. And my proposal is not against the theory of secularization, which is a big play in the realm of sociologists and religious scholars. But my idea is to elaborate a so-called autopoietic point of view about the region. Autopoietic means that is based on the historical and contemporary cultural experiences of the region, which is another kind of experience as in other cultural regions of the globe. And for theologians, it is crucial to learn the language of the region. Not Polish or Hungarian or Slovak, but the region of the common identity, the language of the common identity of the region. And if this can be called as wounded collective identity, then the theology can be inspired to look to the question of wounds in the Christian and in non-Christian traditions too. It is the same as in case of the theology of liberation. They put it in the center of the understanding of the processes of society, the problem of the poor. And then they asked, what is the relevance of this fact in Bible, in the traditional teaching, normative teaching of the church, and so on. And then they elaborated a new kind of theology because they wanted to give an answer to the core element or core marker or core brand of the region Latin America. And we in Central and Eastern Europe, we can discuss it, but we can say, or it is my statement, that the region is characterized by wounded collective identity, and then the theology is contextual only if theology works on this fact. If theology takes this fact as theology generative locus theologicus. It is the sign of the times for us. It is the zeitgeist. And of course, the Christian theology, but not only, the Jewish theology and different Muslim traditions as well, has in their religious and theological understanding the question of suffering, the question of trauma in the center. In the Christian understanding of Jesus Christ, we are solved by his trauma and resurrection. And trauma, the wounds of Christ, is the ID card of Jesus Christ after the, sorry, I want to speak blasphemic. It is the ID card. And the wounds are there. And as all other presenters mentioned openly or latent, the questions, the general feelings of the population, I think then the churches, first of all, the Christian churches, Catholic Church I belong, is provocated to elaborate a theology which takes the core question of the region serious. So not to go to the past, to the time, to the theological logic before the Second World War, and as well not go to the Western European or to the American theological traditions. They have all their own value, but they are less relevant for our own questions. Yeah, sorry, I am always long, old man. They cannot stop. Sorry.
I'm afraid that another conference is needed. Okay, thank you very much. This is so interesting, but well, the time is short. Professor Zuzana Kostičová, I have a question. Because, well, the Czech context is really different from the Polish context. And my experience after 12 years in Poland is that, well, most Polish people of the church or theologians, when they hear about secularization, they think, well, people are losing religion. They are non-religious. Or when they think about religion, they think about, well, going to church or doing some practices. Well, I think it doesn't work for theologians, this view. So my question is whether you could offer some well, definition of religion or a view on religion that could be more complex, that could be more helpful even for theologians, not just for religious studies scholar, to well, handle the topic somehow.
So in other words, you're asking me for a definition of religion.
Yes.
Which is a topic that has never been settled in religious studies, and which is, you know, the main problem that we are all fighting about. All right. Okay, so I think I'm going to approach this from the point of view of institutions. I have caught in one of those, in one of our papers, you know, the word or the term non-institutional religion or non-institutionalized religion. I'm going to be very historically specific because I can't speak about religion theoretically because we would be like 2 years here. And as you said, the time is unfortunately limited, so I can't do this. But what I can do is I can look at the problem of institution. Right? Because this is something religion is usually interpreted with, you know, that religion is something that has institutions, authority, and doctrine. And when speaking about alternative spirituality, many people would say, or specifically those who adhere, the sympathizers, the members, I'd say, of alternative spirituality themselves, they tend to say, we are not religion because we don't have doctrine, we don't have institutions, and we don't have authorities. And we are, therefore, spiritual, not religious. But let me offer an alternative interpretation, which I'm really thinking about in those last few years. I could later provide a link on my article. I've written about this with one of my colleagues. I think that the problem is here that what we are focusing on is the traditional type of institution and the traditional type of doctrine, which is codified somehow. But the problem, that's not a problem, but the situation of Catholic Church, which tends to be given as the prime example of what is religion, is that it had 2,000 years to develop, right? These things, institutions, authorities, doctrines, all these things. Alternative spirituality is young, it's several decades young, and it tends to say we are not like this, but that's not true. They do have doctrines. It's an emerging doctrine, which, although it's not codified and it's not normative, it is still, you just can, you know, working with the text, you just can see it there, right? And as for the institutions, these tend to take really, really long time to develop, like several hundreds of years. Alternative spirituality hasn't had these hundreds of years. It's still, again, very young. So what it does is to slowly develop these institutions on the, and I'd say here, on the basis, on the basic model of the socio-economic regime or system in which it was created. That is, for example, Catholic Church has a past history with feudalism. It has coexisted with feudalism for quite, long time, hundreds of years. And it adopted this type of form. I'm not saying this is something like that the Catholic Church is backwards. That's not true. Everyone has its history. Catholic Church has evolved and other things have emerged. But the church, the form of church, the pertinence of a local parish and things like these are ancient and they don't work that well today. They do work in traditional communities. Still, I'm not saying it's over or something, but alternative spirituality does not adopt this type of form. What it does is to adopt form of, I'd say, economical companies, houses, owned by alternative spirituality enthusiasts who organize workshops and sell things in a local shop downstairs. They have restaurants and stuff like that. This is, I'd say, adapted to the model of capitalism. So that may be the problem, that we tend to look for religion in the ancient terms. And we can see it, we can find it, because there are ancient religions at work today still, but alternative spirituality is not like that. So we tend to be blind. There even has been an article about institutions in alternative spirituality, which is called, hidden right in front of our eyes. Right, the authors are, I think, Anne Taves and one more person. I'm sorry, I just can't remember now. But that is exactly what's happening. We are looking at it and we don't see it because we are looking for something else. I think that may be a useful answer, and I strategically avoided trying to define religion.
I know. Well, thank you. And I suppose that this is especially interesting for us in the Polish context, because, well, we often speak about the interreligious dialogue and about the dialogue with other religions, and we fight people who think we are atheists. So, we might change our perspective a little bit. So, thank you. Well, and question to Professor Urszula Bańkała. One detail from the presentation, which was especially interesting for me. You talked about the way the church, the institutional churches also contribute to desacralization. I mean, that they emphasize, for example, Hildegard from Bingen, they emphasize the issues which are not exactly, religious, I will use the word. Do you think that it is the way to lead the dialogue, or do you, in your experience, think that it is a kind of, cultural suicide for the churches? Because this is something which is new for me, and I have never thought about that in this way.
So I would say it is, I'm not sure whether it happens deliberately, whether it is really a strategy behind that. These are processes we can just observe, and I mentioned several examples. And when we show, especially on the example with Hildegard of Bingen, we have also spiritual exercises according to Ignatius of Loyola, which are also, so to speak, sold as a kind of well-being practices and meditation. That I think it's really a kind of deliberate looking for dialogue and looking to make the church attractive also for people who are outside, and maybe that's to open a floor for encounter for those who are not very familiar with Christian faith or who lost their contact to the church. And it's a kind of to be competitive on the market of different ideas and spiritualities. The process of reconciliation is a little bit different case, because if you look at the documents of people who are engaged in that process, both for the German French and German Polish case, then you can see Christians who really very consciously apply this Christian idea. They say our nations have been for centuries Christian nations, so let's make a use of that Christian idea. But politics is not religion, and in politics it's a kind of derivation from this religious notion of reconciliation, only elements who can be adopted successfully on the political level. And it's not something which is against the church, or it's something where church at the kind of cultural or religious decay of the church, but it's a process which I think it happens somehow without deliberation. And the theology, I think it is also similar to the example of Hildegard of Bingen, a kind of deliberate movement that we have to communicate with the academic community, with other disciplines. So we have to find means of legitimization of our research, and it's not enough to say the source of theology is God's revelation, but we have to be able to indicate also other sources, and to say rather maybe it's not the faith of God is our point of reference, but the believers and what moves them and what motivates them. That is more that what we can catch in academic and research terms, and in order to get into dialogue. So I wouldn't see that so bipolar. It is kind of decay of cultural decay of the church or the strategy. I think it's much more blurred process.
Okay, thank you very much, and also thank you for the links to the articles, also to Professor Zuzana Kościczowa. We can share it later. But my question to Professor Marek Blaza, you talked about the link between the cultural or language identity and the religious or denominational identity. I was wondering, do you think that it is something that helps to the believers to retain their religious identity when they change, for example, the place of the place where they live, or is it a problem for them? Does it help or not?
I think that first thing that already helps is, for example, that the Ukrainians they go to the Greek Catholic Church despite they are Greek Catholic or they are Orthodox or they are Roman Catholics. So it means that there's the first overcoming the denomination. And I also think that we can also see, it is not just my topic, and this is what I didn't mention it, but I think that, that there is a process of to accentuate the inter or non-denominational Christianity. And we can see also Christians who don't associate themselves with any denomination, because Jesus Christ didn't establish any denomination, but Jesus Christ, he is the foundation of Christianity as it is, not of denomination. And in this context, I'd say one real story. One Ukrainian woman, Orthodox, said to me, "Father, I like your parish, I like your community, because you sing here as we sing in my village. I like your homilies because they are in Ukrainians, and your employer, it doesn't interested. I am not interested in your employer, whether it is the Pope of Rome or Patriarch, because I have never seen them, but I do see you. Oh, this is ecclesiology, you know, this is the real ecclesiology. And now the next step would be also, this is good. You see, I have no Ukrainian roots, and I work with the Ukrainians, and they know that I am not Ukrainian, and it means that for them it is not the main issue that I have no Ukrainian roots. What is very important, it is to treat them as partners, and this is sometimes the question, you know, in the relationships, that sometimes you can see that someone from the Roman Catholic Church wants to teach them what to do, but because I am from the more powerful church, and they have the stereotypes, the Ukrainians, because they are the Polish lords, the Polish owners, and we are the peasants, you know, the countrymen. And to change this thinking, it will be very difficult. And the main obstacle, I think, is the history. The Ukrainians usually, they think of their history, they like to talk about the past. And let's stop it. Start to think about the future, not about the past. And this is why the process will be very difficult and will take a long time. But it will be like, you know, the drop of water that will form anyway form anyway something in the heads to change it. Evolution, of course, evolution, not revolution, evolution. And this is why it is important also that there are Poles who come to the Greek Catholic Church, because they give some fresh air to this community. And this is what we can do now. But as I said, we are here in the 80s, 90s. So it is, I think that the secularization, as mostly you were talking about, it is in the future over there. But as far as the war will last in Ukraine, I don't think so that the secularization will come soon, because as I said, where is the war, the religion is needed. Thank you.
Okay, this is also interesting because, well, I suppose that we tend to think about secularization, you know, here in Poland as about something which is definitely negative, that we are losing something. And we can see the example that, well, it is more, well, something like a change in the attitude, and, well, inspiration for us also. By the way, this is why I definitely prefer the title of the last session. Well, I would just ask, do the panelists have questions to each other? Because I will move to the stage Professor Wąsek, the main organizer of the conference. But before, I know we should be ending. But do you have any questions to each other? Issues, something. Well, I'm sure you do, but I know it's 1 o'clock, so. So in that case, I will ask Professor Wąsek to answer the question.
Hello for everybody. Thank you so much to our panelists for participating in the session, for responding positively to the invitation, and for your voice. Of course, Ursula is correct that the phrase in the first panel's term, fighting, is inappropriate to the issue of secularization. Despite the unfortunate wording, I hope it has been corrected in the content of the presentations in both panels today. We were all talking more about dialogue than fighting. But thank you, Ursula, for that observation. The panelists, Zuzanna, Ursula, Andras, and Marek, It is a great honor for us to think with you about important issues, important for all of us. Thank you for your openness and kindness and expert comments. Many thanks to Sister Teresa for guiding us along these intellectual paths. Thank you very much, and may God bless you. This was the last part of our conference, so please let me say a few words in Polish to all the participants now. Proszę Państwa, dziękuję bardzo wszystkim za udział w tej konferencji, panelistom i Państwu, którzy byli biernymi uczestnikami. Bardzo dziękuję za obserwacje, za stawiane pytania. Nie będę tutaj podsumowywał każdej z części tej konferencji, ponieważ wiem, że przy zdalnej konferencji wiele osób jest tylko na jednej z jej części. Chciałbym bardzo podziękować za to spotkanie z kilku powodów. Po pierwsze dlatego, że ja bardzo lubię takie spotkania i z tego też powodu je zorganizowałem. Po drugie dlatego, że uważam, że one są szansą. Budowanie środowiska teologicznego, bardzo szerokiego, jest dziś dla teologii szansą, by wyjść z pewnej zaściankowości, w której w wielu miejscach się znalazła. Po trzecie dlatego, że jest to dla nas zadanie, które stawia nam papież Franciszek, mówiąc o synodalności. Mówił, że ona powinna dotykać także tej części Kościoła, którą tworzą akademicy teolodzy, więc dlatego próbujemy synodalnie się spotykać. Ja wiem, że tego czasu na dyskusję było trochę za mało, więc ta synodalność nie wybrzmiała aż tak dobrze, jak mogłaby, ale wychodzę też z założenia, że lepiej pozostać z niedosytem niż z przesytem. I myślę, że po każdej z tych sesji wszyscy mamy niedosyt. Bardzo serdecznie wszystkim dziękuję i już zapraszam na kolejne odsłony podwawelskich sporów. Jeszcze nie wymyśliłem ostatecznie, na jaki będą temat, natomiast już wiem, że chciałbym się tam spotkać także z wami wszystkimi, tymi czynnymi i tymi wiernymi. Myślę, że to grono tak wspaniałych ekspertów, że niezależnie od tego, jaki będzie temat, to znajdzie się perspektywa, w której będziecie mieli bardzo wiele ciekawych rzeczy do powiedzenia. Będę to brał pod uwagę i mam nadzieję, że tę współpracę będziemy kontynuowali na bardzo wielu polach, także tym towarzyskim. Wszystkim bardzo serdecznie za wszystko dziękuję i mam nadzieję, że do rychłego zobaczenia już na żywo, a nie tylko w tej wirtualnej przestrzeni. Dziękuję bardzo.